Peter Tarnoff is a graduate of Colgate University. He did graduate work at the University of Chicago and the University of Paris. He served as a career Foreign Service officer for 20 years, being stationed in Nigeria, Vietnam, France, Germany, and Luxembourg. He served as the Executive Secretary of the Department of State and as an assistant to Secretaries of State Muskie and Vance. He also was a special assistant to Ambassador Lodge in Vietnam first, and then in Bonn, Paris, and Washington. He also was at the 69 Vietnam peace talks as an assistant to Mr. Lodge. He's written numerous articles on foreign affairs. He's been the member of distinguished international associations, including Inter-American Dialogue and the Trilateral Commission. He served as the Executive Secretary after leaving the Department of State, Executive Director of the World Affairs Council of Northern California, headquartered in San Francisco. And then from 1986 to 1993 was the President of the Council on Foreign Relations, that most central and important leadership organization in foreign affairs in the country. And now he serves, as you all know, as Undersecretary of State for Political Affairs. It's my great pleasure to introduce Secretary Peter Tarnoff.
Thank you, Mr. Byrd. Ladies and gentlemen, it's always a very distinct and personal pleasure for me to come back to a World Affairs Council type organization, having been, as Mr. Byrd indicated, the executive director of a counterpart organization to yours in San Francisco. I felt that my graduation from government service in the 1980s was really a very instructive one and a very useful one by going into the World Affairs Council of Northern California and then spending another 6 or 7 years in a research policy institute outside of government. We have, as you know, a rather unique system in many ways in the United States. And one of the features that we have of people who are given the opportunity to serve in government, to come out, to go back, to be drawn from both public and private life is absolutely critical, I think, to the dynamism that we try to bring to our work, the diversity, especially in light of some of the challenges and many of the new challenges of American foreign policy of the sort that I'll be talking about tonight. What I thought I would like to do is to give you, if not a personal overview, it's very difficult to get too terribly personal when you're a government official, as you can well imagine, although some of us try on occasion, but a sense of what we think we've done and what we'd like to try to do in this 4th year. I like to think, because Secretary Christopher and several of us are modest runners, not sprinters by any means, but we feel that we are entering the 4th lap of our odyssey here. The problem is that unlike in the Atlantic Olympics, we don't know whether we're going to be running 4 laps or 8 laps. Nonetheless, we do have a sense of perspective on what we'll be doing, and I don't think that our policies and our objectives will be much affected by whether the American people vote to re-elect President Clinton or make another choice this November. What we do feel increasingly, though, within the administration is a sense of accomplishment, a sense of momentum, a sense that we have begun to achieve some of the things that the President in particular, aided by his senior foreign policy team, decided early on in the administration would be our overall objectives. We've had our ups and downs, we've had our moments of disappointment and dismay, but also increasingly moments of satisfaction. And I think that the Secretary in particular believed from the outset that it was not possible to achieve everything for the headline of the moment or the diplomatic breakthrough of the month, but that many of the issues that we are dealing with, that we're continuing to deal with, we will make progress on, we will bring about some success, but we won't always be able to bring everything over the line, either in the 1st year or even the 4th year of an administration. Because what I'd like to give you is a sense of perspective on issues that are going to take years, even decades to manage, as all of us confront the 21st century and the post-Cold War world. Nonetheless, at the outset, we felt that we had to begin to define some principles and priorities. And let me tell you what they were, so that you and others can judge how we've been doing and how we're likely to succeed or not succeed in the coming months and years. We felt that it was very important to be active internationally and to have a strong leadership role. In the few remarks that I gave 2.5 years ago talking about America's role in the world, I didn't mean to suggest that it would be any less than it would be before, but we had to be selective. We had to adjust to new realities. With the disappearance of the Soviet Union, the evaporation of the Cold War as an organizing principle of American foreign policy, it was simply not possible to mobilize the resources and the support and the energy of the American people or of our major alliance partners for the same reasons that we had been able to lead this coalition for 45 or 50 years. So we had to be more selective, but we had at the same time to demonstrate that America has its place in the world and that the interests of the American people are well served by a policy of active internationalism. Because we're convinced that to be strong at home, we must be strong abroad. Being strong abroad may not in and of itself be a virtue or even a necessity. But throughout my presentation, I hope throughout the themes that you'll be hearing from administration spokespersons over the course of this year and beyond, if possible, you will hear us saying that if the interests of the American people, the things that we care most about in our daily lives, for our families, for our organizations, for our communities, are to be realized, increasingly we can no longer realize these ambitions for ourselves and our families in purely domestic terms. We have to be thinking increasingly about security and prosperity for ourselves and everything that is dear to us in international terms as well. To do this, we have to also look around the world and make some decisions about priorities. And one of the things that we have to conclude is that there are powers and nations and governments around the world that are quite frankly more important to the U.S. than others. I'm not going to tonight make out for you an A list or a B list or a C list for obvious reasons, and also because countries have a way of jumping from the C list to the A list with disarming frequency. I wish that there were countries, more countries going from the A list to the C list. That's not the way we think. But nonetheless, we have to begin to prioritize our interests and begin to concentrate our efforts on certain capitals, certain countries for different reasons, sometimes strategic, sometimes because they're threats, sometimes because they are key to our prosperity. At the same time, we also said to ourselves that we are in the business of institution building. Not only bilateral relations between Washington and the 10, 12, 15 key capitals around the world, but that we have to begin to look to new institutions in the post-Cold War period. NATO remains obviously important to the security of the United States and our relationship to Western Europe, but NATO itself is transforming itself in ways that I will talk about in a few moments. There are new institutions, APEC, which is the Asian Pacific Economic Council, an organization which is beginning to set certain parameters for economic and even to a certain degree political and security cooperation in Asia is central to us. NAFTA, the North America Free Trade Agreement, is obviously very key to what we're doing. The United Nations, a transformed United Nations, we hope, a reformed but in some respects more responsive and responsible United Nations are also terribly important to us. So this institution building, trying to make sure that those organizations in which the United States plays a leading role, where the United States makes a significant financial and human contribution, are stronger in the years to come. And finally, by way of principle, a certain rededication to the values that have made our country strong: human rights, democracy, institution building, society, helping societies reform themselves in ways that make them more responsive. Not because we are arrogant and want the American model to be applied universally. I think we have enough sense ourselves of the limitations, the struggles that we have in the United States to live up to our own expectations. But because increasingly, whether it be in Latin America over the past decade or Eastern Europe or the former Soviet Union in recent years, we're talking about values and aspirations that are not peculiarly American in origin, but that peoples around the world really do aspire to, because they want to be responsive. They want to be able to have a say in their own government, and they want to be free from the obvious abuses of regimes which were all too well known to us in past decades. And therefore, our dedication to those values and the sense of principle, I think, is equally important. The lessons, among the lessons that we've learned over this 3-year period, is that in many respects, no other country has the overall leadership potential of the United States. Even if, as I indicated before, our objective is, whenever possible, to cooperate multinationally, multilaterally with other countries. That by virtue of the experience that we've had over the last 45 years, the credibility, the sense of integrity and fair-mindedness we have, not with everybody, but with most countries around the world, even when the United States is not going to apply military pressure, even when we're not being called upon to use a large amount of American resources, there tends to be, in places that even we in the State Department have not heard of, at least recently, a sense that the United States has a role to play. The United States can be a broker, a mediator. The United States can offer ideas. The United States can help in international organizations. And that we have to, whether we accept responsibility or not, be mindful of the sense that the world has of the special role that the United States can, if we choose, play in diplomatic activities. This sense of responsibility means that we are forced to make choices and take risks. And there are several cases, I think, where the President has taken risks. Risk for peace, he calls it. But risks also involve the possibility that we will have something less than success, and that there may be situations in which the United States does not come out of a diplomatic commitment or an engagement with others on the ground with a sense of enormous satisfaction and complete success. That's the nature of risk, but I think that we are committed to taking risks. And the sense of risk, I think, has led the risk for peace, has led the administration to the efforts that we've undertaken in Bosnia, Northern Ireland, the Middle East, Haiti, Mexico, Korea, where I'd like to think we have achieved, at least at this point, some measure of success, and I will come back to 2 or 3 of these in a moment. Elsewhere, in Somalia, for example, we have not had that degree of satisfaction and success for reasons, again, we can talk about. But I hope that we've learned from the lessons of the Somalia and certain other places to know that we have to be well prepared. We have to perfect the way we engage ourselves and the way we cooperate with international organizations. And above all, in all of these major commitments, we have to be absolutely direct and open and transparent with the American people. Whether or not the Congress supports us on all or any of these issues, whether or not the President feels that he must act despite reservations in the Congress, the support and understanding of the American people is obviously a foundation of anything that we're going to be doing. Let me talk about advancing the cause of peace in 2 or 3 of the key areas that I've mentioned, and during the discussion period I'm sure we'll come back to these and more. Bosnia is an obvious case in point, where early on the administration, although it was not noticed by everyone at the time, made the decision under the President's leadership to engage the United States to a degree which had not been the case before. The President said that he would not put American troops on the ground, as some asked him to do, as long as the conflict was going on, but he would engage us diplomatically. He would try to get NATO to play a more active role. And although it took 2.5 years for the Dayton peace agreement to be brokered under the leadership of Ambassador Holbrooke and Secretary Christopher and others, nonetheless, we were involved during that 2.5-year period, and we produced what we think is an agreement which gives the parties a chance. It gives them the best chance that they have had, the best chance they're likely to have, not only to hold the country together, but to restore a degree of peace and stability to a very troubled area of the world. Here again, we're talking about a risk for the United States, a risk for the European Union and NATO, our partners who are involved in this enterprise with us, a risk to a certain extent also for the United Nations, which, despite its insufficiencies in Bosnia over the past 3 or 4 years, nonetheless was able to sustain an enormous humanitarian effort on the ground, which provided refuge and food and a certain measure of protection, probably not enough, a certain measure of protection for hundreds of thousands of people during the course of this conflict. In Europe more generally, peace in Europe, how we can build on the fact that after the disappearance of the Soviet Union, there was uncertainty throughout Europe. As new countries emerged, as countries in Central Europe recovered their independence and looked to the West, Western Europe and the United States in particular, for a connection, for a vital tie to prosperity, to democratic institutions, the kind of organization of societies which we represent and which they want to either come to or come back to. In various ways, the United States has been leading the effort, working very closely with the Western Europeans, to provide incentives to these governments and peoples to stick to the path of reform, to hold to their pattern of democratic institutions, despite the uncertainties of this period, despite the fact that in many of the countries of the former Warsaw Pact and in many of the countries which have emerged from the former Soviet Union, people are living less well, or at least some significant numbers of people are living less well now than they did under the last years of communism. So therefore, NATO and the European Union are looking out. They're intending to expand over time so as to incorporate members to the East on a gradual basis. And again, to provide incentives for reform so that these countries realize that if they hold to it, if they cooperate with their neighbors and they hold to their own objectives of democratic institutions and economic reform, there's a prospect for integration and closer relations in the West. The Middle East, where Secretary Christopher has spent so much of his time, coming back as he did several days ago from his 16th trip to the Middle East in just about 3 years. A good deal has been achieved. The declaration of principles between the Israelis and the Palestinians, the peace with Jordan, a real chance at a comprehensive peace beginning to emerge, with Syria, of course, being the last absolutely critical piece of peace, as spelled different ways, as you can imagine. In the mosaic that we are all working on. The West Bank and Gaza elections of the weekend are really very satisfying to us and to the Israelis and the Palestinians as we look at this first really substantial effort at the expression of a democratic voice of the Palestinian people. Here again, it's very difficult to predict what will happen during the course of the year. But I think in the Middle East, probably more than on any of the other priority issues we're looking at, we're talking about an administration which did not invent a policy, did not create an initiative. We're talking about 7 or 8 U.S. administrations going back 30 years, all of whom in varying degrees, but all of whom have spent a good deal of time, including the activities of presidents of the United States and secretaries of state, on the Middle East. And if it happens this year, and we remain dedicated to the proposition that this administration will spend a lot of time on trying to fit the Syrian peace into this mosaic in the Middle East. If it happens, we will be enormously pleased, but we will also take pride, not only for ourselves, but for our predecessors, Republicans and Democrats, liberals and conservatives, who over the past 30 years have made really a heroic effort on behalf of all of the citizens of our country to achieve peace in the Middle East. I could go on with various of the countries that are familiar to you, but why don't I pass now into a whole different realm of new security challenges, of issues which 5, certainly 10 years ago were not on the screen in the State Department. I left the department in 1982 to pursue work in the private sector, as Mr. Burd indicated, for about 10 years. And when I came back, the single greatest change for me was to see that there were issues that we had to contend with which no one had paid much attention to a decade or so before. And I think these issues are obvious to you. Their proliferation. The proliferation of nuclear weapons, the fact that increasingly not only governments, and there are some governments, but individuals or movements can acquire nuclear weapons that represent an enormous threat to cities, to countries, maybe even to the United States. What we're going to try to do in the course of this year is to build on the fact that the international community ratified the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty last year. And this year, there's an opportunity to conclude a comprehensive test ban treaty, to ratify the Chemical Weapons Convention, and also to have the United States and Russia ratify the SALT II agreement. There's going to be a nuclear summit in Moscow in April, chaired by President Yeltsin, which will bring the industrialized democracies in other countries, such as Russia, Ukraine, probably others, together to talk about issues of nuclear safety and how we can work together to police the proliferation of nuclear devices, work on nuclear terrorism, and try to show that we have the will, we have the wherewithal to contain the obvious threats of proliferation for all of us. Much of our activity in North Korea over the past 2.5 years has been because of the threat that the North Koreans would break out and develop their own nuclear program, which represented a substantial threat of nuclear terrorism. Much of what we're doing to remain vigilant in the case of Iraq and Iran also relates to the nuclear issue, although these countries represent other sorts of dangers that I will be talking about in a moment. The fact that 20-some countries have come together now in the past 2 or 3 weeks in Holland to adopt a regime so that there will be common practices throughout the West and in some of the newly emerging democracies with respect to the export of technical equipment to the rogue countries, Libya, Iraq, Iran, North Korea, several others in particular, so as to make it more difficult, not impossible, but more difficult for these countries to acquire nuclear weapons and other weapons of mass destruction, is an enormous effort of coordination where we're spending our time. Another one of these new threat issues is, of course, narcotics, where in certain respects we are very pleased at the progress that we've made. In Colombia, as you know, working with various agencies of the U.S. government, the Colombian government has pretty much put an end to the dominance of the Medellin and now the Cali cartel. There is unprecedented cooperation, much of it quiet, and I hope you appreciate the reasons for it, among governments on narcotics cooperation, not only in terms of trying to stem the flow of narcotics into this country, but going against the kingpins and, almost as importantly, going against the financial institutions who handle the enormous amounts, the billions, even tens of billions of dollars of money that is transacted as a result of these illegal transfers of funds. Because if you can go against the kingpins and you can go against the financial institutions which launder and handle the money, you are suddenly providing an incentive for these people to reassess and to ask themselves whether at the top of the food chain, not at the bottom of the food chain, the people in the field or even the people selling on the street, at the top of the food chain, internationally and domestically, you want people to begin to think that they are at risk, and it's not only the small grower or the small seller who will be the subject of law enforcement activity. Of course, in international drug policies, much of this is linked to our domestic efforts at demand reduction through prevention, treatment, and law enforcement. Then there's the issue of terrorism, something which until recently the United States has been relatively exempt from, but the specter is now with us. The World Trade Center bombing was an obvious case in point. But in 1995, the gas attacks in the subways in Tokyo, the bomb threats, the bombings in France reconfirms the fact that international terrorism knows no boundaries, and that developed countries, as well as some of the less stable countries around the world, can be victimized by these events. It's our concern about terrorism, which is our primary reason for waging a campaign against the activities of the government of Iran. Because of all the governments around the world that we've been able to identify, and we have a pretty good, if not perfect, idea of what these governments are up to, on a whole range of terrorism-related issues, Iran is clearly at the top of the list. And it's one reason why the President undertook to increase the level of sanctions against Iran and to continue to try to mobilize international opinion against Iran in the course of last year. Same thing applies for Libya, which in addition to holding the two individuals responsible for the bombing of the Pan Am flight that cost hundreds of lives, American and foreign, is also a state sponsor of terrorism. And the fact that increasingly justice ministers, FBI-type organizations around the world, and others involved, DEA-type organizations around the world, are cooperating and meeting and seeing each other more frequently, if discreetly, shows that the kind of concerns, the fears that we have about these encroachments, nuclear proliferation, terrorism, narcotics, just to name three, are very important on the international scene and the international agenda. As a matter of fact, I think that you will see when the G7, when the leaders of the industrialized nations plus Russia meet in Lyon, France in late June of this year, I wouldn't be surprised if for the first time a separate declaration on terrorism, on some of these law enforcement type issues, does not emerge from the meetings. In the past, they've talked about Bosnia, they've talked about other issues of common concern, but it's interesting that this whole cluster of law enforcement issues has risen to the top of the personal political agendas of a great number of our closest friends and allies around the world. Environment, population, the whole range of issues that concern us as a nation, given our worry about the atmosphere in which we live, also received a tremendous amount of impetus in this administration. We've done a lot, we've ratified a lot, and also we have begun to establish what we call common agendas with a whole series of nations around the world. Japan, China are just two examples of countries where, in addition to our complex economic and political relations, at the highest level, we have established a whole range of common agenda issues on law enforcement, on economic issues, on environmental issues, population, just so that presidents and prime ministers can be assured that there is bilateral cooperation between ourselves and some of the key countries around the world. I know you've had my colleague Tim Wirth as a speaker here in Baltimore. And I can imagine that Tim spoke a good deal about this, because more than anyone in this administration, former Senator Wirth has undertaken to design and execute, negotiate and execute these common agendas with some of the largest countries around the world. Economic prosperity, which is not thought of as the a normal responsibility of the State Department, is, I would like to say, also very high on our agenda. Because the President made clear during the transition, after his election, but before he was inaugurated, that among the highest priorities of this administration, and reflecting, of course, some of the priorities, some of the sensitivities during the presidential campaign of 1992 itself, international economic advancement, supporting American economic interests, was the job of all of us who were involved in foreign policy. And therefore, as I referred to before, some of the institutions that we have been building reflect these economic priorities. And I remember early in the administration, I was accompanying a foreign minister of one of our major trading partners, a country with whom we have had a fair number of trade disputes over the world, around the world, who had just come from the Commerce Department and then the Treasury Department, and came to the State Department, and we were walking out. We happened to have been old friends. He turned to me and he said, "You know, I didn't hear anything different from Secretary Christopher than I heard from Senator Benson or Senator Brown or Ambassador Cantor on trade issues." And he looked shocked. And I said, "Well, Mr. Minister, I hope that you realize that we're very pleased you didn't hear anything different from my boss compared to the other cabinet secretaries around the world, because we do have an integrated approach, and we really believe that in the case of our major trading partners and economic allies, that the question of equity, of opening markets, is something that they've got to hear from the political side of the House, the security people, as well as our economic counterparts." Now, in 1996, let me talk about some of the special challenges we're going to face in the current months. Russia. Obviously, following the last December's parliamentary election, and with the prospect of the presidential elections in June of this year, is obviously going to be a central priority for this administration and for governments around the world. The President intends to be in Moscow in April to attend the nuclear proliferation summit that I mentioned before, but he will also take advantage of his presence there for that purpose to have a bilateral meeting with President Yeltsin, something that he has tried to do every 6 months since coming into office. As you know, this is an unsettled period in Russia. Although President Yeltsin confirmed today that he is almost certainly going to be a candidate himself, his own campaign is one that will come under intense scrutiny, not only domestically but internationally. We have seen the forces of reform suffer setbacks in the past in Russia after the disappearance of the Soviet Union. But we have also seen a certain resiliency in the system. The fact that the political system itself is functioning well and openly, even if the results are at times distressing to the more reform-minded elements. The fact that freedom of the press is operating really in a very conspicuous way, going so far as to report things that would never have crossed the mind of many of the Soviets of the old days and even surprise the Russians today, I think will be the mainstays of what this campaign will be about. Of course, in Russia and other parts of the former Warsaw Pact region, the issue of prosperity is enormous importance. The issue of continuity and stability of new institutions will be talked about over the next 4 or 5 months, and we can only be hopeful that reform will have, if not satisfied, at least shown the way to enough people so that it will survive in a reasonable way. It's always difficult to predict events of this sort, difficult to predict what this year's political wars will deliver in the United States. But there is progress in Russia. There are important sectors of public opinion who are believing that things are getting better, that there is hope out there, and we're convinced at least that the Russian people will look to what is working in the country now and vote accordingly. That doesn't mean they will vote for one candidate or another, but it seems very unlikely that there will be a reversion to the old days, that some of the thoughts and some of the people who were discredited so completely during the course of the new Russian Revolution will come back into positions comparable in any way to what they had in the past. China, which is a key relationship, one that is in many respects the most complex that we have, because of the breadth of interests and elements that we have with China. A little over 2 years ago, President Clinton decided, after a good deal of thought and discussion within the administration, that we would adopt a policy of comprehensive engagement with the Chinese. Going to the Chinese at the highest levels, including the President himself with President Jiang Zemin of China, and saying that China and the United States have an enormous amount of issues to deal with, economically, politically, strategically. The fact that we are both permanent members of the Security Council, that China is a dominant partner, a dominant player in a part of the world, Asia, of increasing importance to the United States, not only politically, but playing a dominant role in the American economy these days. And the fact that the Chinese economy is likely to become the second largest in the world in the next decade and beyond, who can tell, but China being an obvious major partner for the United States. This is a complex relationship, and one that does not fully satisfy either the leaders of China or the United States, because we have outstanding issues that bother us: human rights, proliferation. Many trade issues are very difficult to deal with in China. But we hope over the longer term we have been able to impress on our Chinese interlocutors the fact that we take this relationship seriously. And it's important to engage, it's important to manage it, and we hope over the course of the year, despite some uncertainties in China about U.S. motives and some concerns that we have about the direction the Chinese have taken on some of the issues that I've mentioned, that it will be possible to engage, including at the highest levels. The President will be seeing the President of China at least once this year, so that we can demonstrate that over the course of not only the next years, but the next decades, the United States and China have an enormous amount of business to do together, and we should try to do so constructively in the best possible atmosphere. And finally, Japan, a country which over decades now has been a unique partner of the United States. I think presidents for many years have said there's no more important bilateral relationship between the United States than the one we have in Japan. With Japan. Japan has a new government, a government which will be around for at least some period of time throughout the course of the year and maybe into next year. And Japan is also aspiring to play a greater role internationally. It's one reason why the Japanese are seeking, with very strong U.S. support, to have a permanent seat on the Security Council of the United Nations, a place where I think they can play an enormously constructive role. The fact that Japan, now 50 years after the end of the war, is regarded throughout the world increasingly as a responsible, highly respected world partner, country that's willing to put its money and increasingly its people around the world to engage in international peacekeeping efforts is something that we want to encourage. It's been slow in coming, slower than we would have liked in some respects. But I think the prospect of Japan playing this kind of role of international stability is something that will be accelerated with the present government in Japan, and something that we will encourage ourselves. Here again, the President will be in Japan in April, working with the new Prime Minister with this very much in mind. Now, increasingly, before I make 2 or 3 very brief concluding remarks, let me say that whatever our agenda, whatever our objectives are, we are faced with the prospect of increased doubt about whether the American diplomatic establishment is going to have the tools and the wherewithal to complete anything resembling the mission that I have outlined to you. It is, I'm afraid, impossible for the United States, whether it be led by a Democratic president or a Republican president, to lead, to play the kind of responsive role which I believe serves the interests of the American people if the leadership of the executive branch is weakened. In other words, and this is not a partisan remark because it would apply equally to a Republican president as to a Democratic president. If there is micromanagement from a Congress, whether it be of the president's party or another party, which makes it impossible for the president to make commitments, requires the president on occasion to confront the majority in Congress and do what he wants, something that many in the Congress would prefer to have him do on his own. It creates a degree of uncertainty about American leadership for which we will pay a price overseas. I think the same thing applies if the funding levels for the diplomatic, let me put it more broadly, for the foreign affairs departments and agencies goes below a point, so that we can no longer staff our missions overseas. We can no longer have the best and the brightest from the schools around this country reflecting the diversity and the dynamism of our higher education system coming into the Foreign Service, making a career choice in a growth area, in an area which they believe in, but they also must believe is responsive to the needs of the American people and will be so treated by the Congress and the country. And finally, I think it's important for us to confront very openly the questions of isolationism, questions of taking risks for peace or not taking risks for peace. I gave you the risks that we in the administration have chosen to take, and there may be others that some would rather have had us concentrate on. There may be some on the list which some would rather have had us pass on. So whether you or any member of Congress or any one of our fellow citizens agrees with the specific list, I think the proposition that it's in our interest to take these risks for peace, knowing that there is no guarantee of absolute success in every case, is a proposition which we have to defend. We've been doing it successfully, if not brilliantly, for the last 50 years, and if we begin pulling back, if our first instinct is to pull back, assess, wait for someone else to do it, I think we'll pay a price, not only in terms of international stability, but in terms of the interests of the American people. The year ahead, and even the decades ahead, is, of course, a key time in our history. It's also a very important time for organizations such as your council, councils around the world, organizations who represent the uniquely vigorous non-governmental sector of American public opinion to play a role. Because in many respects, the debate about America's role in the world, I think, is as essential and as critical now as it was after the Second War. We are reaching a point where we have to be making some fundamental decisions, not only on the issues that I was talking about, as important as they are in the short and medium term, but on what our priorities are internationally and what kind of role we want the United States to play to defend our interests and how it should be different, how it should be vigorous, but different from what happened in the past. I hope very much that you here in Baltimore, as close as you are to Washington, will come down and see us, as well as inviting us up here, and invite the people who have very different opinions from the ones that you may have heard from Tim Wirth and Dennis Ross and some of my colleagues in the State Department. Because it's important that you hear them, and it's important that they hear you. But I'm very grateful, as I said, for personal as well as professional reasons for your invitations. And I hope we'll have an opportunity now to have a full and frank discussion, including some questions, if you'd like, about these issues or anything else that you have on your mind. Thank you.
Mr. Secretary, we thank you for that extraordinarily comprehensive and helpful overview. The Secretary has agreed to answer questions until 10 minutes after 7. Yes, sir. The question is, who in addition to Japan, or which countries in addition to Japan, would you support for membership in the Security Council, and would they, of course, be permanent members?
Yes, we favor the addition of Japan and Germany immediately as members, as permanent members of the Security Council, but we feel that the list should expand beyond there. There are now 15 members of the Security Council, 5 permanent, 10 rotating. In our view, the number should go up to about 20. If you get much above 20, we're concerned that it becomes muddled, it becomes confused. There are too many players in the inner circles of the Security Council, a body that's worked remarkably well over the last several years. So while we favor the addition of 2, we would like to leave it to regional organizations and others to determine how 2 or 3 others might be added into the Security Council mix. It is, as you can imagine, and I'm sure all of you know, a very complicated issue to add members to any rather exclusive organization, and the Security Council is no exception. On your question about the veto, again, this is for members to decide, but in our view, being a permanent member of the Security Council involves a veto, and any new members should probably be entitled to have the same veto that the present permanent members have.
The question invites you to comment on the administration's understanding of the role of the military in support of American foreign policy, including the problems of stretching commitments in that institution too far.
It's a very good question. It's so good that I think the best way for me to answer is to challenge your premise, you see. I think that's... Then you get to the heart of what the objection may be. And I guess I do challenge your premise. If you go over the 10 or 12 issues that I mentioned, and I don't have the list in front of me, very few of them involve even a marginal application of American military pressure. Of course, that's the case in Bosnia, obviously. We're no longer in Somalia. Haiti, we will no longer be in Haiti as of, we're not in Lebanon. I mean, let's not, 10 years ago. Let's talk about the current agenda for today. If you look at the 8, 10, or 12 issues that I touched on in varying degrees, very few of them involve a commitment of U.S. military forces. We have Bosnia. If there is a conclusion of an agreement between Syria and Israel with respect to peace between these 2 countries and a resolution of the situation on the Golan Heights, we expect that there will be some appeal to the United States and others for some U.S. military presence there, but it will be quite small. And I think that you, as you go over the list of the proliferation matters that I was talking about, of the diplomatic mediations that we are doing, we are really not talking about new commitments of American troops. Now, the fact remains, nonetheless, that the military, the U.S. military, over the past 2, 3, and 4 years has undergone a substantial reassessment and reorganization of its own forces. And there have been reductions, there have been drawdowns. But for the kind of military support that we will need for the diplomatic agenda, I'm not talking about for things that more appropriately can be addressed here by representatives of the Department of Defense and the Joint Chiefs of Staff, we are not looking to much expanded activity on the part of the American military to support our diplomatic efforts. And even in Bosnia, as you know, the President was very firm that the NATO commitment, which means, of course, the United States, will end in December of next year. So we are trying to the maximum extent possible to limit the amount of American force that's going to be needed overseas for the kind of diplomatic agenda that I was talking to you about.
Do you have anything to say about our putting troops on the Mexican border? This is not Woodrow Wilson's era coming back, but for control of drug traffic.
The border is a problem. It's an enormous problem in terms of drug trafficking, in terms of people coming across it, and other illegal activities. And this is a priority that the administration is spending a good deal of time on. We've had a whole series of meetings, including not too long ago with President Zedillo on this issue. With respect to the question that you pose, however, we do not see that the militarization of the border is the way to answer it. There are other ways that we prefer to use to attack the question, and let me mention 2 or 3 of them. Cooperation with the Mexican law enforcement authorities so that there is more screening, more activity on the Mexican side of the border with respect to these activities is very important. Secondly, enhancement of customs, immigration officials, border patrol people is very important, and substantial numbers of new people have been added to the border patrol operation in recent months. So while we are enhancing our activities on the border, and it does remain a problem, we do not propose to deploy the U.S. military in order to meet that challenge.
The last part of the question is, what size international incident are you willing to tolerate? But the basic question was, is piracy on the high seas a problem, and what would you propose doing about it?
Yes. There is a piracy problem in the South China Sea and around Southeast Asia, but not only involving alleged Chinese mafia and criminal elements, but several of the countries in Southeast Asia are also involved in this. And we have supported efforts by these countries to increase their intelligence and to increase their ability to cooperate among themselves in order to track these people and to bring them to justice. As you know, in the years following the fall of Saigon, 1975, and immediately afterwards, the hundreds of thousands of Vietnamese who fled by water were often subjected to pirates coming not principally from China. As a matter of fact, I think very few of them came from China. Most of them came from Southeast Asia, and many of those boats were victimized. As that flow has receded substantially, that particular part of the problem has gone away. I see. I'm not. I must tell you, I'm not aware of that. I'm not aware of that problem to that degree, and I have not heard, which is not to say that there isn't more than I'm aware of, any allegations with respect to Chinese government or Chinese government institutions involved. If you'd like to give me a note on it, I'll look into it. But I'd not been aware of it in that degree. We have alien smuggling issues with coming out of China that I'm sure you're aware of, and that is large numbers of Chinese aliens coming across the Pacific for the purposes of illegal immigration into the United States. Here we have cooperated really quite well with the Chinese governments and with other governments to intercept these people and to return them forthwith to China. But again, I'm not aware of the details of the particular issue that you raise, I'm afraid.
I believe the question is sort of in the area of asking for your comments upon the difficulties of the enhancement of international organizations and the building of sound governments in a variety of smaller regimes around the world.
I've heard a fair number of people advance the first part of the proposition that you made. Namely that the UN is simply beyond repair, and that too many of the governments that I've talked about around the world are probably irreparable in terms of what anyone can reasonably do for them. Before I get to the second part of your proposition, let me just say that we believe that that is not the case. And in any case, if it is in our national interest to try to bring about reforms in the United Nations, and goodness knows they're needed, if it's in our interest to have some sort of international organization serve as a forum for peaceful resolution of disputes and be able over time to dispatch people around the world so the United States and NATO don't have to do it, where our interests are at stake, so that the organization will be able to sustain the work of the specialized agencies, the humanitarian organizations, which have made such an enormous difference to the health and welfare of the world. We should do it. Without a guarantee of success, we should do it. What I've never heard is the second part of your proposition, or your interlocutor's proposition, and that is because the UN isn't going to work and these countries are beyond the pale, therefore we should take it over. What you sometimes hear is the first proposition, the second proposition, and therefore we should walk away from it. We should let them to their own devices. We should pull out of the United Nations. We should let these countries go their way, wish them well, but have nothing to do with them. An equally dangerous conclusion, in my view, but never quite the conclusion that the person you talked to, I didn't want to call him your friend because you didn't say he was your friend, advanced to you.
There are two possible questions. One is, are we prepared to take a bold step with respect to Taiwan policy, A, or B, are we prepared to take a bold step with respect to our policy toward the People's Republic of China, coming out of a sensitivity to the dignity and interests of the Taiwanese?
Well, you're absolutely right that Taiwan is an issue of enormous sensitivity to the Chinese for reasons that I think all of you understand. It is also true, as you mentioned, that developments in Taiwan have been absolutely remarkable. There will be a free and fair election in March of this year. And the whole fabric of Taiwanese society is demonstrating an openness, a transparency, which would have been difficult to imagine certainly 10 years ago. And that evolution is a very positive one, not only for the people of Taiwan, because it demonstrates in a region of the world where there are still some leaders who say that democratic values are not Asian in character, that given a chance, people in Asia, like people in the United States or elsewhere around the world, have the same basic needs and want to express themselves in ways that are appropriate. But on the Taiwan-China issue, I think ultimately we favor very much what is called the cross-straits dialogue between the People's Republic of China and Taiwan. This is a dialogue that has been working well over the past several years. It's had its moments of interruption, and now is one of them, following the admission into this country of Lei Dong-wei of Taiwan and leading up to the elections in March. But that there's an extraordinary amount of intercourse between the People's Republic of China and Taiwan. 1 million Taiwanese a year visit China. Taiwan is estimated to be the third largest investor in the People's Republic, going from virtually nothing 7 or 8 years ago to enormous potential. And assuming, as we hope, the transition to Chinese sovereignty in Hong Kong goes well in the middle of next year, we think that while the same formula will obviously not apply to Taiwan anytime soon, that understanding between the leaders of Taiwan and the People's Republic of China is so overwhelmingly in their mutual interest that it should hold them together in a bond, if not of trust, but of cooperation. This is something that the United States can help promote and will promote in an even-handed way, while recognizing, of course, the sovereignty of the People's Republic of China in international capacities. It should be possible to reach that state of better understanding and stability, but this is going to be a critical year for the reasons that you mentioned.
How difficult do you find the situation in Chechnya?
Our moderator is a way of cutting through to the essential kernel of the question. But let me answer at least the opening. We did that. If you look at that being condemning both the taking of hostages on the part of the Chechens and the overreaction on the part of the Russians. That was a carefully crafted statement that was made by Nick Burns, our press spokesman, also made by Secretary Christopher at Harvard last week, because we do believe that you should say more than one thing in connection with this incident, namely that the taking of hostages, the victimization of innocent people is obviously beyond the pale. It's a form of terrorism along the lines of what we were talking about before. But at the same time, the Russians reacted in a way that confirms their inability to understand that there has to be a dialogue, there has to be a greater willingness towards reconciliation and understanding than they have been able to muster up to this point. And the situation is still, as you know, a very tenuous one. There are still some smaller hostage situations involving Chechens which are unresolved. And in this pre-electoral period in Russia, one has to be very sensitive to the fact that the U.S. and other major countries in the world are going to be confronted with having to say things if, as is possible, these instances multiply in the coming weeks and months, which is, I'm afraid, highly possible.
The question is, do our current policies encourage the Russians and Chinese to become closer friends than they might otherwise?
The reason I hesitate is that I'm not sure that it's a bad thing for Russia and China to become closer. And therefore, if our policies are responsible for it, I don't know whether I should be defensive. I know that Dmitry is saying something different. Dmitry Simes is saying something different. He's saying that the degree of alienation that has crept into our relationship with the Chinese and some of the frustrations that we're now having the Russians naturally lead the two of them to have greater areas of understanding. But in a larger perspective, I think it's a defensible proposition in U.S. interest for some of the very heavy residue of suspicion and animosity that existed for decades between China and Russia to be reduced. I think the fact that the Russians and Chinese were at loggerheads, were almost at each other's throats for a long period of time, did not promote stability in a vital area of the world. And therefore, I think that a process of making progress in the relationship, of reconciliation between China and Russia is a good thing. Nonetheless, on key issues, I don't see the Chinese and the Russians allying themselves in an effective way against the United States. I think both in the case of Russia and China, the vitality of our bilateral relationships, despite the problems, indicates to both Moscow and Beijing that they have to deal with the United States. They've got to deal with us seriously, whether we agree or not. And therefore, I don't see the reconciliation between China and Russia as representing a particular threat to the United States. On the contrary, in some respects.
The first negative decision on the part of the World Trade Organization against the United States has been made. It concerns the standards which we have on imported oil. And you're asked for your observations about this, and I assume whatever this means for U.S. sovereignty.
Not because of the hour, but because of my lack of knowledge, my answer can be mercifully short. I don't know. But if you give me a note, I'll try to find out for you.
I knew there was a reason why we waited this long. It was to find out if there was a question Mr. Tarnoff couldn't handle excellently. Thanks very much.